So you need to notify them first that you're collecting the data, and then you also need to notify them of the purpose and by extension also how you'll use that data. Yeah.
So a person can directly report you to Office of the Data Protection Commissioner.
Yes, so they can file a complaint. In terms of consent, the burden of proof falls on the person who has collected the data. So it falls on the controller or the processor.
Hello guys, welcome to the podcast. Today we are here with a data guru, a lawyer, and also a data guru in terms of privacy. Let her introduce herself, then we can commence.
Hi everyone, my name is Moreen Mwangi. I am a lawyer. I practice in different areas, and one of them is data protection and privacy law.
So today we are talking about privacy and why is it important. Tell us, why is privacy important? Why should it be private?
Okay, so privacy is important first because data is an incredible resource that companies can use for different purposes. So, for example, you might think that your ID number is just an ordinary number, but your ID number can tell a lot about you. Your financial information, for example, can also tell a lot about you and can be used by companies to decide what kind of marketing information they want to send to you. It can be used to decide where to segment you as a customer, for example. So because of the importance of data and how it can be used by companies for their research, for their marketing purposes, then it's important that people are aware of what their data is being used for, and they're aware of the rights that they have in regards to that data.
That's talking a lot to me because I think I'm one of the people who collect a lot of data.
Okay.
And I'm now wondering in terms of how do we use this data. So in terms of data privacy, maybe we can start in terms of international, looking in terms of GDPR, because that's one of the most laws or other legal frameworks that affects us in Kenya, especially. What is GDPR, or rather, what are the legal frameworks in the globe that might affect different people who are working in terms of, or rather, who should worry about data protection?
So the key one that you've mentioned already is the GDPR. In full, it's called the General Data Protection Regulation. So people started hearing a lot about it in 2018 because that's when the enforcement of the GDPR began. So it's a regulation which was passed by the EU. And even though it was passed by the EU, it affects companies, entities, organizations across the globe, because any entity that is processing data belonging to data subjects who are in the EU, whether they are residents or citizens, it means that they would have to comply with the provisions of the GDPR. So that's why the GDPR is one of the most touted or most heard of regulations in terms of data protection and privacy. So even if you're based in Kenya, in Rwanda, in South Africa, but you're processing data that belongs to European subjects, then you would be subject to the provisions of the GDPR. It's also very important because the EU organizations or the bodies that are in charge of enforcing the GDPR are quite active. So if you do not abide by the regulations in the GDPR, then you could find yourself being on the wrong side of the law and being issued with a penalty notice or having to compensate data subjects in the EU. So it's quite important that if you're handling any data or processing data that is, especially personal data that relates to EU subjects, then you should comply with the regulations of the GDPR.
I think right now we'll be moving around because I've had here a lot of information, or rather a lot of, what do you call them, terms which we need probably to define.
Okay.
So probably let's talk about personal data. What is personal data to start with?
Okay, so personal data is defined as data which can either identify a person.
Yeah.
So specifically, for example, the Kenyan Act would say data that is identifiable or can identify a person, which means that if you're given that piece of data, you'd be able to trace the person that the data relates to. So I will give an example. If someone gives an ID number, it might just look like a number to someone, but if you go into maybe there's a certain database on eCitizen, for example, where you can check someone's ID number. Let's say if you're registering on eCitizen and you put that certain ID number, then it will bring you the details and say, okay, are you this person? Because that database expects that if a person is using this number to register, then it must be person X. Something else which can be identified to you, a passport number, for example. Your name is also personal data because someone can trace that if the name is, let's say, John Doe, then I know John Doe is a specific person. So personal data is different from data which is not identifiable. For example, would be data like if I'm told you have 2 cars, I'm told person X has 2 cars, I may not know which specific person is being referred to. But if I'm given an ID number, I can easily find who has that ID number.
Yeah.
So personal data is just data which can be used to identify
A person.
Yeah.
So I believe examples of personal data can be email addresses,
Yeah, that was
phone numbers,
yes.
As you have mentioned, ID numbers, full names as
Yes,
well.
yeah.
So that's one. The second one, I think you have mentioned, I've heard here, is data subjects.
Okay.
So who are data subjects in this instance as well?
Okay, so a data subject is the person who the data relates to. So you could say it's the owner of the data or just the person that is being referred to. So for example, in the case of an ID number, it would be the person whose number we are referring to or the person whose name is being referred to. So it's just the owner of the data or the person being referred to.
Now let's dig deep into now the people, or rather processing the data. So I saw 2 terms, one being data processor, the other one being data controller. So how do we, that's in regards to the Kenya Data Protection Act.
Yes.
So what's the difference between data processor and data controller?
Okay, so just in simple terms, I would say a controller is a person who decides what to do with the data, who decides how the data will be maybe stored or handled. And then a processor is the person who's given instructions to now handle the data or do whatever action is needed. So there are many times where a controller will also be a processor because they're the ones who collect the data, they know why they're collecting the data, they're the ones who decide how it will be handled, and they're the same ones who will also now handle and process the data. But there are a lot of instances where a controller will give instructions to a processor to now handle the data, store, and process depending on the purposes. So a processor can be instructed maybe by way of a contract, for example. So a controller can have a contract with a processor, which will outline what the processor can do with the data. So that's just the difference. Controller is the one who decides why the data is being collected and how it is to be used. And then the processor is the one who does the action of now processing and handling the data as per what is required.
Now let's go back to GDPR. So from what I've heard is European Union created now the data protection policy, which also they are very stringent, or rather they are very strict in terms of enforcement. So what are the elements within the data protection policy from GDPR, that is?
So the first one I'd mention that's quite important is just the right to notify a data subject when you're collecting their data. So you need to notify them first that you're collecting the data, and then you also need to notify them of the purpose and by extension also the use, how you'll use that data. So for example, if you are a financial institution and you're collecting data from someone, maybe you're collecting their phone number, their email address, you would need to let them know that because you're entering into this contract with us, where you expect this financial institution to provide you with some kind of service, then they will collect your phone number, your email address, or whatever other personal data. You also need to let them know why you're collecting. So in that case, for example, in the case of a financial institution, they would be collecting the data so as to be able to give you the service that you require. So for example, if you require a banking service, then it means they'll need to collect your data so that they can verify your identity, maybe as part of the know your customer requirements. And then they also need to store that data because in the course of the business relationship, they will need to rely on that data maybe to give you correspondence. So maybe they need your email address so they can be sending you correspondence and whatnot. Also, you need to inform them of uses such as marketing. So something I see on a lot of privacy policies is that if a company wants to be sending you marketing information, they should also tell you that, because we now have your data, then we're also going to be using it to send you marketing communication. And if you're not okay with it, then you have the right to also to opt out. That's also a key aspect of the GDPR. You can opt out of certain uses of your data if you're not happy. And then as the data subject, of course, because this institution has the right to notify you, then you also have the right to consent. And by extension, also you have the right to withdraw consent. So consent needs to be something that is clear. It's something that you give affirmatively, not just it shouldn't be something that is not clear. We're not sure how you gave the consent for your information to be collected. It must be something that's communicated to you that, hey, John Doe, we are collecting your information so that we can use it for these purposes. So consent needs to be something that is clear and affirmative so that there's no doubt that you give your consent for the data to be collected. And again, even if you give your consent, you have the right to withdraw your consent at any point. So if you feel like you don't want to work with this institution anymore, or for whatever reason you don't want your data to be processed by them, you also have the right to withdraw consent. So I'd say those are the one of the major requirements under the GDPR.
I think that's quite important because I believe even for marketing people, what they usually do while collecting even, because data is also the videos and etc. It's that consent.
Yeah.
So it's something that probably now it's being enforced and they're looking into it on how to use it. And yeah. So that's in terms of GDPR. Maybe any other legal within other institutions or other regions or countries that probably we should be interested on.
Okay. So I'll speak about the Kenyan context. So in the Kenyan context, we have the Data Protection Act. It was enacted in 2019. So I'd say it's modeled on the GDPR because a lot of the provisions are similar. And if you are compliant with the Data Protection Act, then it means because most of the provisions are similar, then it means also you would be like almost compliant with the GDPR as well. So it's important that if you're using those standards, if you're compliant with the Kenya Data Protection Act, you would use the similar standards for any European data. Data that you process belonging to European data subjects. So Data Protection Act, just like an overview, it also has the same requirements in terms of the right to notify data subjects when you're collecting their data. It has the right for data subjects to give their consent, to withdraw their consent, and they can also request for rectification of data, modification of data if anything is inaccurate or misleading, and you can also request for erasure of your data. So if an institution collects your data and you'd want for them to erase, you can also ask for them to erase, unless there's like specific requirements under other Kenyan laws where they have to keep certain data for a certain amount of time. So similarly, with the Data Protection Act in Kenya, institutions which are outside Kenya but which process data belonging to Kenyan citizens or residents would also be subject to the Data Protection Act. So I would say that any organization, entity, company, even non-governmental organizations I'd say pretty much across the globe, as long as you are processing data from data subjects who are not in the jurisdiction where you're in, then you need to check those jurisdictions. If they have data protection laws, then you would need to comply with them. Because anyone can bring a complaint, for example, and say that there's a certain entity in, let's say, Rwanda that is handling my data. I'm a Kenyan citizen, they're handling my data, and maybe they've not handled it the proper way. Maybe they didn't ask for my consent before sending me marketing communications or such a thing. So if you're an entity anywhere in the world handling Kenyan data subjects, data belonging to Kenyan data subjects, then you would need to also comply with the Data Protection Act.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay. So we have talked in terms of the components and maybe the compliance part. So probably what steps should the organization take to comply with especially Kenyan Data Protection Act?
Okay. So the first thing I'll mention is, depending on the size of the organization and maybe the data that you handle, there's a requirement for registration. So not all organizations or companies or entities would be required to register. It's dependent on the turnover, the number of employees, and also for some instances, it's dependent on the data they're handling. So the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner, they have some guidelines on registration, but I'll just touch briefly on them. So for organizations which have turnover or revenue of more than 5 million Kenya shillings and also more than 10 employees, then they would be required to register. Now, for smaller organizations which have not reached that revenue or those number of employees, they would not be required to register. However, there's a requirement for entities which are handling certain types of data to register, whether they meet those requirements for revenue and employees. So, for example, entities handling any health-related data, telecommunications data, financial data, educational institutions as well. So, for example, if you have a school which has even 10 or 15 students, for example, maybe they don't have revenue of 5 million and they have very few employees, they would still be required to register because of the kind of data that they handle. So I would say, if you want to be sure whether you need to register, you should check the guidelines for the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner. They are more detailed depending on the kind of data you're handling and also revenue and employees. But that's just an overview. Then I'd say also the second thing is that first I also need to add that even if you're not required to register, you will still be required to abide by the provisions in the Act. So even if you're a small entity and you're processing personal data and you're not required to register, you would still be required to abide by the provisions in the Act. The other thing that I should mention, in terms of data protection, entities should think of it as something that you should embed in your practices, like from day one. So the Act actually refers to something called privacy by design and also by default. So this means that when you're designing your processes and your systems, you should embed privacy as a consideration in your systems and your processes, which means that as you're thinking, let's say if you want to have like a mobile application, for example, as you're thinking of how you're going to structure that mobile application, you should have privacy embedded into it so that anyone who's going to use that mobile application will know that their data is going to be safe. So, for example, there shouldn't be an application which just wants to collect data that is unnecessary. Maybe if it's something financial related, then it should only collect data which is necessary for those financial services that will be offered. Maybe if it's something related to like a fitness app, there's no need to collect maybe data on financial data if it's something related to fitness. For fitness, you should just collect maybe someone's weight, someone's height, maybe what they want, how much they eat in a day or something like that. So when you embed privacy, it means that then your systems will only collect the data that is necessary and also relevant for the purpose. Then in terms of compliance as well, you need to think about something like consent, quite important. Whenever you collect data from a data subject, you need to let them know what the data is for. So something that I see happening a lot, sometimes I order from an Instagram shop, for example, and then they ask for my number because they want to deliver something to my address. And then after they deliver the package, they send me maybe promotional messages and say, "Hi, Moreen, we have new stock that we've brought in." And while you might look at it as a business person and think that you're maximizing because you have this person's number, so you want to send them some information, at the time when they asked for my number, it was to do a delivery. So they didn't ask me, can we send you marketing communication? Can we send you messages that we have new stock? So whenever you're collecting data from someone, personal data, you have to let them know what you will use it for, and they have to give clear, informed consent. So you have to tell them, okay, this is data we're going to collect it for the purposes of sending you marketing communication or for the purposes of doing our research on consumer insights and whatnot, and they have to give their consent. And then something else in regards to compliance, something that the Act also mentions, whenever there's a breach, you need to let the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner know within a reasonable time, and you also need to let your data subject know. And as well as when you're letting them know, you also need to tell them what actions you're taking in order to prevent further breaches or to prevent the misuse of their information. Yeah, so I'd say those are the key things under compliance. Yeah.
I think I've heard you mentioning protection by default. Tell me more about it.
Okay, so protection by default it's related to that aspect of by design. So by default is that when you're coming up with systems, then by default they should only just ask for information that is relevant. So as I said, if you have that example of a fitness app, for example, it should not require people to give maybe details of their KRA PIN because that's not relevant for something related to fitness, but it can require them to give information about their height and weight. So when you have any system that you come up with for your organization, for your company, any mobile application, maybe website, it should just require by default. It's not something that it should just require information that is necessary and relevant. And the reason why it should be by default is so that it even gives the consumer or the customer more confidence that there will be privacy, that their data will be handled in a way that is compliant with the Act. So that is why it's specifically stated as by default. So that is something that comes naturally to the system or to the system or the application that you have. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is more or less collecting only necessary data that will do the job that you want to do, rather than you collecting more information for you to have more information. And so I think that's one of the areas that most of people struggle.
Okay. Let me just add something. The reason why the Act is so particular on data that is necessary and relevant is because, as you said, you can just collect data and have it, and then this data could land in anyone's hands and be misused. But if you're collecting data that's just specific for a purpose, then it first of all limits the amount of data that you collect from people. And in a way, by limiting the amount of data, you're also limiting the risk of that data, unnecessary data being shared maybe with third parties or coming into the hands of people who are not authorized to handle the data. So just know that even as an entity, as a company, collect only the data that is necessary and relevant for the purpose that you want it for. And that's why also when you're notifying a consumer or a customer about collecting their data, you also have to tell them the purpose for which you're collecting, so that they're giving consent for that particular purpose.
And that's important, because also if you're collecting necessary data, I believe also there's a cost element into it because,
Yeah.
for example, storing that, or rather having people to collect that information, it's a cost.
Yeah.
But also storage of that data, it's also a cost because it has to say in a server, maybe you have to pay that server space. So
Yeah.
also it will assist you to reduce the cost aspect, especially for that. Yeah, so that's quite important. Now, I think looking in terms of now the down steps, because I believe right now, another thing which I believe I should mention before looking in how we can implement it within an organization. I believe also the registration cost
Okay.
within the Office of Data Protection Commissioner, it's tied
Yeah.
based on what you have mentioned, costs
Yeah.
and or rather turnover and
Number of
number of
employees.
employees, because I believe also the cheapest cost is 4,000
Yeah.
for registration, and that registration also stays for like 2 years if
Yeah.
I'm correct.
You need to
So
renew after 2 years. Yeah.
yeah, so that's in terms of the cost element. Also, it's not that as much as we thought, but also it might change depending with how much money you're making per year, as well as how many employees do you have within that organization.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's something which I would mention. Then looking in terms of how organizations can help being either registering, or the organizations who have they're not required to register, how they can protect themselves. Maybe thinking of how do they develop policies,
Okay.
because governance policies within an organization for them to, one, be compliant, two, also to handle breaches.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think you have already talked about breaches and the steps which probably they can take. So having like a policy on handling breaches, as well as governance of data protection, and maybe also having a focal point within the organization who can
Yeah.
also handle the complaints, because you have to be proactive before the complaints reach Moreen's hands.
Yeah.
Probably you need to have acted on it.
Okay.
Yeah, so probably having a focal point who can handle those complaints before, either through, what do we call it, mediation, and yeah, such strategies before it goes quite tired.
Yeah, but also in terms of the focal point, let me also mention that the Data Protection Act also provides for certain organizations to have a data protection officer.
Yeah.
So this is like a person in the organization who is the, as you said, for example, the focal point in the organization related to matters data protection. So it's not a requirement for all entities, but I'd say entities which are handling large amounts of data, certain types of sensitive data, then they would need to have a data protection officer. So I'd say, for example, any insurance company, any telecommunications company, any bank, any financial institution should have a data protection officer because of the amounts of data that they would be handling. Any social media related company, any online retailer, for example, because they would be taking in large amounts of data and processing large amounts of data on a daily basis. So, like off the top of my head, I'd say like a Jumia or a Kilimall, insurance companies, financial institutions, hospitals, they would need. So the Act actually provides for certain organizations to have a data protection officer. And also, why it's important for those organizations to have a data protection officer, they will act as a focal point. They'll also be in charge of training and capacity building for the rest of the staff. Because something I've found with data protection is that it's something that the staff at large need to be trained on how to handle data. Because you might think that if you have a data protection officer, you're safe. But if that person who is maybe receiving clients at the reception does not know that I should handle a person's ID card, for example, in a certain way, then you would easily be liable for failure to adhere to the Data Protection Act. So data protection officer would be responsible for training, be the focal point, and even in certain instances, it's the person who the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner, for example, would ask for information in terms of how the company is adhering to data protection.
Tell us more about the complaints and so how can they handle the complaints rather than organization?
So under the Data Protection Act, the Kenyan one, the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner has the power to receive complaints from members of the public regarding any violations of the Act. So I'll just give like a number of instances which I've seen in a lot of the complaints that have come up. So one common instance, for example, is when you go for an event and then someone takes a photo of the event and you've appeared in the photo, and then they use that photo on social media for marketing purposes. Another common instance I've seen, this is especially for employees. So you might think that the data that you're collecting is just for customers or consumers, but as an entity, if you have employees, you're also responsible for handling employees' data responsibly and according to the Act. So a common occurrence I've seen is where maybe employees will be at an event, then the employer takes photos of the event and puts on maybe their LinkedIn, any other social media, and says, oh, we had this event today, or we had this outreach, or this maybe activation today, without telling the employees that these images will be used for that purpose. Another common instance is receiving promotional messages which you did not sign up for. So, for example, I usually receive every morning a message from a number that I'm pretty sure I didn't sign up for. And they send me, it's a motivational message, so it's a good message, but it's a message I did not sign up for. So that's also a common complaint. So I'd say that entities need to be really careful about their data protection policies and procedures, because people are more aware of their rights in terms of data protection. So there are a lot of complaints being filed with the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner. And I'd say the ODPC, it's called the ODPC in short, it's quite active in terms of rendering those decisions. So you could easily find yourself on the wrong side of a complaint and having to pay maybe up to even 500,000 Kenya shillings in compensation to a customer, to a consumer, or even to your employee, because you've not abided by the provisions in the Data Protection Act. And actually, in assessing the complaints, the Data Protection Commissioner also looks at the company's internal procedures and processes regarding data protection. So it's important that entities and companies have those procedures, because that's one of the things that the Data Protection Commissioner will assess. They'll also assess whether they've received maybe repeat complaints from a certain institution. So I've seen a lot of these financial institutions that give loans, these short-term loans to people. A lot of them have repeat complaints. And you know what that does is that when the ODPC is looking into your complaint, they're more likely to even give more punitive compensation amounts, because they see that this is something that is being repeated and no actions are being taken in that regard. So if entities or companies don't want to find themselves on the wrong side of a complaint where they're having to pay compensation to customers, to employees, then they have to abide by the regulations of the Data Protection Act.
So a person can directly report you to Office of the Data Protection Commissioner?
Yes, so they can file a complaint, and they can say, for example, you did not give your consent for your photo to be used in a certain way, or you did not give your consent to receive promotional messages. And you see, in those instances, it's also important, that also shows the importance of a data protection officer, for example. So certain entities, they'd send you marketing messages, and then you tell them to stop sending you. And because they don't have a focal point, a person who's in charge of data protection, then no one really acts on that message. No one actually takes that action of deleting your number from their servers or from the information that they have. So it becomes a repeated thing, and by the time it gets to the office of the Data Protection Commissioner, I can go and say that I've told these people repeatedly, you show information, maybe you've sent them emails or text messages and nobody has acted on it. So again, that also showcases the importance of a data protection officer. So it can be the focal point, the person who receives requests for data. So if I want a company to delete my data, modify, to stop sending me messages, that would be the person that would receive such requests and act on them. So you can look at the ODPC publishes the decisions that they have. So they're open to the public. You can see if companies are interested to see what are the common complaints that come up. That's something that you can also look at and see how to guard yourself against such complaints.
Okay, that's quite important, or rather it's quite interesting to learn. And probably also looking in terms of consent. What is consent? Because sometimes in events, you see just a photo written there. This is a this is a photogenic event. Expect photos to be taken and to be used. Is that really consent, or do I need to say yes or no, or even write yes or no? What is that? What's the level of consent a person has?
So the Act actually says consent should be clear, unequivocal, affirmative. So if you look at it in the context of, if you go to an event and you see a banner written, this is an event where photos will be taken and they'll be used in this way, it's not clear, it's not unequivocal, because some people may not see that notice. Even if you have seen it, they've not given the exact purpose for why they're collecting your image. So they might just say that, okay, this is an event where your photos will be taken. So consent needs to be, they need to come to you and say, okay, we've taken this image and we want to put it on our Instagram page. Are you okay with that? And in terms of the complaints that are filed at the ODPC, there's something called burden of proof in legal terms. So burden of proof means who has that responsibility of proving something. So in terms of consent, the burden of proof falls on the person who has collected the data. So it falls on the controller or the processor. So to be on the safe side, it's better for the controller or the processor to actually have something that is clear that this person gave consent for their image to be taken, they give consent for them to receive marketing messages. So a banner that is placed somewhere will not amount to consent. And there's actually an ODPC decision that was issued against a certain nightclub. I don't remember the name, but it was issued against a certain club because they had taken a photo of revelers and then posted on their Instagram page. So as a controller or a processor, just think that burden of proof is on you, so you need to be on the safe side. Consent needs to be clear and equivocal, something that we would not be doubting, would not be in doubt. So I need to come to you and say, this photo is going to be posted. If I've taken photos of my employees at an event, I need to tell them this photo is going to be posted on the Facebook page so that they don't come back later and say, we were not told that this, we are not told this photo is going to be posted. So be on the safe side and just have clear and equivocal, consent.
Consent, okay. Yeah. Any parting shot?
Okay, I'd say parting shot. Data is a very important resource. So you should guard it the way you would guard your property, any other physical property that you have. And it's important that you are aware of the rights that you have in terms of data. And then for entities, companies, organizations, parting shot would be have data protection and privacy policies embedded into your systems, if you have websites, mobile applications, and if you have them embedded into your systems, then it's easier to comply, because from the onset, your systems are primed to succeed. That's my parting shot.
Awesome. It's been great having you here.
Thank you.
Probably I should ask for a data protection consent to post this video. But yeah, so anyway.
Yeah. Okay, I've given my consent clearly and on on the record.
Yeah, awesome. But yeah, so in case you go for an event or other event, people probably need to rethink from having poster saying it's taking photo, probably thinking maybe embed it within your ticketing or something of that sort.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
For a person to consent to take your photo. So that might be quite important for you to think of. And it's been great having you around during this cold morning. So and it's quite important for us to be compliant and to be within the data protection policy. It's been great. Stay safe, stay beneath the impact.
Thanks for tuning in to Beneath the Impact, where we go beyond the numbers and narratives to uncover what really drives change. If today's conversation sparked a thought, shifted your perspective, or started a question, don't keep it to yourself. Share this episode, like, subscribe, leave us a comment, and join the conversation online. You can find us at beneath.the.impact on all socials. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep digging beneath the impact.